He was the deputy U.S. trade representative. He was the U.S. ambassador to China, most recently for President Obama. He is a true Asia specialist. We don't have that many true Asia specialists at the heights of the U.S. government. And I know several of the people that would qualify in that category, and I can say that John Huntsman is the only one of them who is electable. And this is what's really unique about his career, is that he's achieved so much on the international front as a executive branch official, yet he is a very popular politician with his constituents. He is twice elected governor of Utah, the second time by a record percentage vote. He's an extraordinary public servant who also ran for the Republican nomination for president in 2012. And I think, although it was a rough campaign, I think it was, in many ways, his finest hour. There's this phrase in American English, speak truth to power, and people say it's rare. Well, it is too rare, perhaps. But there's something even more rare, which is to speak truth to party. And Ambassador Huntsman spoke truth to party. I just want to close by a personal note, which is that I've said to many people who are in this room that one of the great privileges of my career was to work with the Foreign Service officers and civil servants who work on China policy in the U.S. government. And one of my experiences in the U.S. government was to ask people who had been there a long time who were the great bosses. So when I asked people who was the best Secretary of State that they ever worked for, almost to a person, people said Princeton's own George Shultz. When I asked my team, my crew, who worked for Ambassador Huntsman in Beijing soon after they worked for me in Washington or worked with me in Washington, who their best boss was, I can somewhat jealously report, almost to a person, they said Ambassador John Huntsman. And that's real leadership. When people are instilled with a combination of respect, loyalty, and affection, that's real leadership, and Ambassador Huntsman embodies that. I'm going to turn the microphone over to him, and I'm going to ask him a few questions after he gives a short speech, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience for your questions. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Governor John Huntsman.
Tom, that was mighty kind of you. A totally undeserved introduction, and I'm honored to be in your presence, one of the truly outstanding Foreign Service officers this nation has produced in recent years. I know that to be the case. Some of you know that to be the case, but I just want to remind Tom that he's a pretty special person. I'm glad that my daughter, Gracie, was here to take all of that in, Tom. Because I have to remind her from time to time that I'm okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to Gracie May Huntsman right here, my daughter. Gracie, stand up. Stand up, Gracie. Now, Gracie played a critically important role during our run for the presidency. She served as my senior foreign policy advisor. People didn't believe me when I actually told them that in town hall meeting after town hall meeting, but in fact, she was our senior foreign policy advisor. And if it isn't the most egregious of sins to be here on the Princeton campus after last night at Penn, basking in the glow of friends and academic faculty in Philadelphia, I have my own daughter, Gracie, who arrives on campus. She makes a beeline for the bookstore. She buys a Princeton shirt. She brings it back to me and she says, "Dad, I think I'm going to apply one of these days." And I say, the world is a changing place. Gracie also witnessed the travails and vicissitudes of presidential politics. You know, we were cruising along, we were doing okay. And then a guy by the name of Michael Moore went on television, a well-known liberal, and he said, "That Huntsman guy, he's actually a Republican I could vote for one of these days." And I saw our numbers in Iowa go right like this. And I said, "We are so toast." And And then Bill Clinton got on television, and he said, that Huntsman guy, he seemed pretty unhotbound. He's actually a Republican. I could support one of these days. South Carolina, right in the drain. So people said, gee, Huntsman, you only took third in New Hampshire. I said, if only you could have taken my journey. And we did take third in New Hampshire. It's an interesting thing, you know, for those of you thinking about running for president someday. We should talk. We should talk. But there's nothing more grueling, or I should say more satisfying, than the grassroots Adlai Stevenson shoe leather of New Hampshire. They care about politics there. And you'd see the same people, you know, after 15 town hall meetings, they'd be there. You see the same faces all over the place. And they'd come up and just say, I'm almost there. I just need to hear you one more time, and I might be there. But the marketplace put us at second place finish in New Hampshire. Those were the expectations. And presidential politics takes on sort of a stock trading quality in the sense that the marketplace pretty much values you within the universe of players. And if you don't meet the market expectations, you're then discounted in the marketplace. So you don't hit second, which was a market expectation for us. We took third. You know, the fundraising doesn't come in. It takes a little bit of air out of the tires, so to speak. And after New Hampshire, I thought, I just have to be honest with those who have been kind enough to take this ride with us. I don't want to waste your time anymore. We didn't do what we thought we could do. It's time to move on. And we did. But I've got to tell you, it was the most incredible ride we have ever taken, and I'm grateful for it. I want to leave just a couple of thoughts behind, honest, off-the-cuff remarks that will probably get me in trouble. They always do. You know, I went on the Colbert Report instead of my own party's convention, and I got completely lacerated for that one. But I just want to leave a couple of thoughts behind, and then we're going to go to Tom, who also should have put in perspective you know, the most important point of all, and that is, I'm just a failed rock and roll musician. That's all I wanted to do, and I did my best, and you know, we didn't make the big time. And so, what do you do as a failed rock musician? You go into politics. Isn't that the natural fallback position, for heaven's sake? So, the point number one is this. I can't underestimate to you students here how critically important it will be to infuse your energy, your intellect, and your worldview into politics as soon as you can get there. And I don't care where you call home. I know there's some of you from overseas. Your countries will need the same thing because we're sort of stalled right now in terms of global growth and leadership. And for reasons we can talk about, and I can share with you some experiences on Capitol Hill recently with a no labels movement that I'm co-chairing, but we're stuck. And incomes are falling, and the kids who graduated back in 2006, 2007, they did okay, and you aren't going to do as well. You know, on average, maybe 7 to 8% less in terms of real income. So you're doing everything you're supposed to do. You go out, you get a good education, you go out and try to find a job, and it's increasingly difficult to pay the bills, to cover the tuition, the educational costs that you're carrying. And that's where we are, and we've got to do something about that dynamic. But we're not going to be able to do anything about it until we recognize that one of the greatest challenges we have is not an external challenge. You know, it isn't about Iraq, it isn't about Afghanistan, it's about us here at home, and about how divided we have become, and how we seem to park ourselves down these little alleyways of life and feed ourselves with information that only reinforces our own biases. And we walk away thinking we've now been informed. If John F. Kennedy were to come back to this country, if Ronald Reagan were to come back, for heaven's sake, he didn't leave so long ago, but I'm reminded that John F. Kennedy gave a great speech at American University almost exactly 50 years ago, in which he talked about the Soviet threat. He talked about nuclear annihilation. He talked about the prospects for world peace and how difficult that would be to achieve. And if he were to come back today, he would be shocked. We don't have a Soviet Union anymore. We have a much different threat. It's a proliferation threat. It isn't a nuclear annihilation threat. And I think he would probably remind us all that our challenges are right here within, and it's the way we treat one another, and it's the way we find ourselves so divided around issues that otherwise ought to bring us together. Look what is playing out in Boston, for heaven's sake. We've been shaken. The whole country has been shaken by what has played out in Boston. Yet when there is a need in this country, we pull together as a people, we dismiss the party affiliation, and we get the job done. We cry together, we mourn together, and then we get our work done. That's our tradition. And it isn't working on the political side. I just wish I could bottle up some of what I see playing out in Boston among the local emergency responders, among the educators, among the political class, Republican and Democrat, who are coming around a challenge and trying to do the right thing. You wish you could bottle that up and let it loose on Capitol Hill, but that isn't to be, unfortunately. We need your energy. And all I would say to you young folks here who are lucky enough to be called the Woody Woos, I want you to, when you leave this building today and you walk through this bucolic campus, I want you to stop, and I want you to take a big, deep breath, and I want you to reflect on where you are in your life. You know how lucky you are to be here? You know how extraordinary it is to be on this campus, one of the greatest institutions in the world, at the Woodrow Wilson School, for heaven's sake. I hope a day doesn't go by where you just sort of wander into class and think the same old thoughts and not get inspired about where you're going and about what your future is. Don't let a day go by where that happens. I want you to stop outside. I want you to take a breath, and I want you to reflect on where you are. And if I could ask each one of you individually, I would say, give me your name, where are you from, and how are you going to change the world? And if you haven't figured out in your own lives how you're going to go out and change the world, you're wasting your time. Because while you're here, among the Tom Christiansens of the world and many others, some of the greatest thinkers and doers and practitioners anywhere in this country, take advantage. Become an expert at something that you can then contribute toward once you get out of here. Don't become a generalist. Everybody's a generalist. And we don't need any more generalists in politics. Become an expert at something that will make this country a better place. And don't let cynicism take hold. Do not let cynicism infect your brain, because we're over if that happens. My generation is going to be totally reliant on yours to get out there in maintaining a level of enthusiasm and a can-do spirit. And I know you can do it, because this nation remakes itself all the time. We get down, we face despair, feel despair, and we get back on our feet. Like Alexis de Tocqueville used to say, you know, we're pretty good at mending our wounds. We're not perfect, but we're pretty good at mending our wounds. Point number two, what are the issues that you all are going to have to deal with going forward? Let me just be perfectly honest about this. The economy is going to improve. I have no doubt about that. Unemployment's going to go down, maybe have a 6 in front of it at some point. We'll be feeling better about things. Growth is going to go up. Our manufacturing base might even heal and rehabilitate a little bit. And then the big issue of the day, let's face it, we're all consumed with jobs and how to make the economy work right now. But the big issue of the day for you, I believe, will be how do you take a dysfunctional system and make it work? And that's going to require, to my mind, some structural changes. It's a little bit like, you know, the economy in Europe. This isn't a cyclical thing we're going through. It's a structural phenomenon. And because of that, you got to deal with debt, you got to deal with banking reform, and you got to deal with spending practices. Well, in this country, we're dealing with a structural problem on the political side. I am absolutely convinced. And you all, in your energy and enthusiasm and quest for better ideas tomorrow, are going to have to tackle things like campaign finance reform. Because the way that we're funding campaigns today is an abomination. Super PACs are destroying this democracy. Now, how do I know? Because I've been out doing it. I've been on the candidate side, knocking on doors and raising money. And I'll tell you this, you could get people of average intelligence in a room and ask them to come up with a way to handle election financing, and there's no way on earth they would come up with the system we have today. We can do a whole lot better, and we're going to have to do a whole lot better because it's resulting in a kind of crony capitalism. Nobody wants to call it that. We call it corruption in other countries. But we've got crony capitalism in this country. And the only way we're going to fix it is getting to the root cause, which is the money that circulates in politics. to have a single individual who can drop $50 million into somebody's camp. Give me a break. And somebody, some people will say, well, what about, freedom of speech? I get all that part. I've read Buckley Vallejo 71, and I followed all that stuff. I've been on both sides of this issue. And all I can tell you, when somebody puts $50 million into somebody's camp, it crowds out a whole lot of other voices that will never be heard because they can't afford to play it at that level. So you got to do something about it. Number two, I'm absolutely convinced that our lack of term limits in Congress is hurting us, because there's this thing called incumbency that grows very deep roots. And pretty soon nobody wants to leave. It reaches up and grabs folks, and they become just part of the system. There's a great senator from the state of Utah. He was elected the year I got my driver's license. I'm a pretty old guy. He's a good man. He's well-intentioned. He's still there. Just re-elected, I think, on a platform of change or something like that. But we've got to get serious about people getting in, making a contribution, applying their level of energy and intellectual know-how, and then moving on. And third, you all are going to have to figure out what to do about how we've gerrymandered our way into a country that is 70% predictable. Red and blue, Republican, Democrat, MSNBC, Fox News. Nobody cares about the general election anymore. It's about the primary. They don't want to be primaried because that's where they're going to lose the election. So you back up all of the crazy behavior now even earlier in the campaign cycle, because if they get through the primary, you win the general. It's totally, the outcome is guaranteed pretty much. And why do we have that? Well, I tried to get an independent redistricting commission when I was governor. The legislature didn't want it. It was written into our Constitution. Totally understandable. They didn't want to give up that prerogative. But meanwhile, we have boundaries that are drawn that look a little bit like northern Kashmir, when the British left in 1947 for no rhyme or reason. It's just kind of the way it is. And we deserve better than that. And it won't be an easy fix. And term limits won't be an easy fix. And campaign finance reform, people laugh whenever I talk about that. And I say, oh, you mean we can split the atom, and we can put a man on the moon, and we can create a level of innovation that this world has never seen, but we can't figure out a way to finance campaigns better than we're doing today. Number three, and I'll wrap up here in a second, Tom. The problem in Congress isn't about ideology, because we all have our own worldviews. It is inconceivable that we're all going to be homogenized in terms of our approach to problem solving in politics. It isn't about ideology. It's about extreme partisanship, because it pays to be on the extreme end. You get the money, you get on the talk shows, you get to attend all of the cool events, and meanwhile, you get 70% of the people in this country who are saying, what about me? Who's got my back? Who's watching out for my interests? And it isn't happening today. Why isn't work getting done in Congress? Well, we've taken away any incentives for people to want to find problems. It doesn't pay to grind away and find solutions to our everyday problems. We have to figure out some way to create a culture that speaks to problem solving once again in this country. We can do it. Absolutely we can do it. But it's going to have to be recreating a culture that speaks to problem solving. And finally, let me just say, I've never been more optimistic about where this country is going economically. Now, that might not be a smart or a wise or an informed comment to make, but I see what's happening out there, and I see what's happening throughout the world. And I think where we find ourselves as a country is in a very unique place in history. China is experiencing periods of real uncertainty and insecurity, I might add, even with the new leadership that's taken the reins, the fifth generation. Europe is flat. Latin America is sort of embroiled in a bit of finger pointing. And we're here, still 25% of the world's GDP, 320 million people, a streak and a spirit of innovation that is second to none. And I look at the ways that we could be fueling ourselves in the future, which will be absolutely revolutionary, and I look at our health sciences revolution that is occurring thanks to the end of the Human Genome Project and soon to be personalized medicine that I think is going to completely transform the landscape for attacking human disease, extending human life, and even dealing with healthcare costs. And I look at the education reform agenda, where the efforts will be made, I think, like never before, to get education to more people in this country in ways that really do bring up our standards overall. It's out there, and let me just remind you of this in conclusion. So when I was born in 1960, just to give you a sense of change and why I think the technology dynamic is going to be so profoundly important. Now, so let me just bring it close to home for a moment. Gracie sits on her Skype at our home, and she talks to friends in Beijing. So Friday night in the United States, Saturday morning in Beijing, Skype to Skype. I've never seen anything like this before. Just as an example of where this new generation is going. And they talk, a little Chinese, a little English, talk about boys, talk about bands, talk about movies, and it's seamless. And I think there's no way that the earlier generation could have done this. The barriers were way too high. They were impenetrable. And for my parents' generation, forget about it. It was all sort of an Atlantic-based model. And Gracie gets on Skype, and it's seamless. And I say, this is an amazing world that we are entering, where there is greater points of common interest in thinking than ever before. It's about our political class and whether we can create an environment to unleash the kind of energy that I think is going to be present in the new generation. But when I was born in 1960, we exported $3 for every $2 we imported. We ran a pretty good trade surplus. We own 36% of the world's GDP. Healthcare as a percentage of our GDP was probably 2% as opposed to 18 or 19%. Challenges, no question about it. Opportunities, get this. So when I was born, same year, a call to India costs about $12 a minute. Today, a call to India, free, if you know how to do it. 0.01 cents a minute. And I can't even begin to tell you how that's going to free up commerce over just sort of the interconnectedness of that create. The cost of sequencing a gene, 1974. And I chair a cancer institute in my spare time, so I follow the world of genomics as closely as a civilian can, and it is the most exciting area I think I've ever seen, and will continue to be. $150 million in 1974 to sequence a gene. The cost to sequence a gene today, 0.01 cents. And I needn't tell you what this is going to do to extending human life and conquering human disease, well beyond our ability to describe it today. The cost for computer storage, 1960, $2 million a megabyte. $2 million a megabyte. And then along came IBM in 1976 with the 370, remember that? And they took it from $2 million to $1 million a megabyte. And Gracie now walks into the Apple store, buys an iPod, 160 gigabytes for $249. On an equivalency basis, you're looking at 1 megabyte equaling 0.0016 pennies. Is the world moving with lightning speed? The world is moving forward with lightning speed and totally in need of your energy and your passion and your solutions. Thank you all so very much for having me. Thank you.
I was tasked to ask the first few questions and then turn it over to the audience, and I wanted to ask a question from each of the areas of Ambassador Huntsman's expertise. I wanted to start with domestic economy, which was something you touched upon in your speech. And I wanted to ask you about the challenges that faced the United States in 2008, do a retrospective. You have a financial crisis and you have a big deficit. A stimulus was created to get the economy going, or at least stop the free fall. There's been a big debate about the wisdom of the stimulus, both in terms of its size and its content. and in terms of the length in which it was pursued. And I'm wondering, in retrospect, whether you think the stimulus in general was a wise move, whether you think the content of it was well structured, and whether you think stimulus was the right emphasis as opposed to deficit control, given the outstanding deficit that we had. Some people at Princeton famously have weighed in on this weekly, and I won't name names, but I was interested in your take on it.
Well, let's just back up and talk about the spending side of the equation, which I like to see as something that isn't red or blue or Republican or Democrat. It's basic math. And if you do nothing about entitlements, you get to 2020, and then you have some real decisions to make because something will be crowded out. And what's that going to be? Is it going to be, disaster response? Is it going to be Department of Defense? You name it. But if you do want to extrapolate out the numbers, you'll have to do something. That's just a mathematical certainty. So do we have to deal with spending? When your revenue is 18 or 19% of your balance sheet and your expenditures are 23 or 20? Of course you do. On the stimulus side, I want to take you back to 2007, 2008, because a lot of people like to think that, the world was different then. But let me tell you what the world was in 2007. Every governor in the United States was in favor of a stimulus plan, except one, Mark Sanford. But I'm not going to talk about those two together because every single governor but one. But here's where I think we had a problem, because most every governor took the stimulus dollars that were then allocated on a sort of population state size basis, and they put them into programs that didn't yield much in the way of a return. I think if we had stepped back, and I was chair of the Western Governors Association at the time, and we were actually banding together Republicans and Democrats saying, we need a smart grid. If you really want to take our new energy economy seriously, you got to quit talking, you got to build something. If we want to take from the sun and wind, which I think will be inevitable over time, science will take us there, economics will probably take, we're not there yet, but a good investment would be something like that. Yet we didn't get that kind of focused investment. So I have nothing against a stimulus during a time of need, so long as it is carefully matched with the needs of our nation in ways that would produce a long-term return, that would stimulate additional investment, that would stimulate innovation, and that would really get us ahead in the game of economic development and technology advancement. I look back, and if you do the accounting, states, were able to replenish their coffers a little bit, and I've got to tell you, we put much of ours toward highways and transportation. We were the fastest growing state in America at the time. We had enormous needs to get people around, and so that's where much of ours went. But I also did it based on the argument that as our unemployment went up, we needed jobs, and that drove much of our thinking. So I would say that about the stimulus. Let me conclude with a thought, because China has their own challenges on the stimulus side, going back to 2008, Tom, that you're well aware of, and that what's a 4 trillion yuan stimulus package, which in dollar form was probably $650 billion. I'd say on a per GDP basis, the largest stimulus package in the history of the world. I would argue that they're still working through their stimulus spending, and they don't have a proper accounting for it. And I think they will end up with some roads to nowhere and high inventory buildups that people haven't recognized yet. And I think this is going to be a problem this year, maybe going into next year. One, as it relates to basic commodity prices, because they may have overbuilt in that regard. And number two, the financial relationships with institutions that may not be under any kind of supervisory or regulatory regime, the so-called shadow banking institutions. I don't think we've seen a proper accounting of that, and that may continue to hobble China's economic prospects for some time.
Thanks very much. The second area of expertise that I want to touch upon is trade, and people use the term champion of free trade for a lot of people, but Ambassador Huntsman negotiated what we used to call the gold standard free trade agreement when I was in the government, and that's the free trade agreement we had with Singapore. and it became the standard bearer for all future negotiations. So I know you believe in this, so I'm not going to ask you the question, do you believe in free trade, because I know the answer, and you know I agree with you on it. What I want to ask you is, how can you explain to the many Americans who continue in public opinion polls to express resistance and fear of trade, that trade has been a major engine of growth for the United States, that trade has helped our economy and our national security for decades? How do you convince these very skeptical members of our public who still to this day, in many public opinion polls, a majority of them will say that trade is hurting us?
Well, first of all, people have to see the benefits of trade, and not enough people do. And it isn't a large enough part of our GDP mix, as it is in many other countries completely rely upon trade. Their exports as a percentage of GDP, 80, 90% in some Asian countries. You have to export to survive. In our country, it isn't a big enough portion of our GDP to where we have full-blown conversations about the pros and cons. Moreover, when the economy collapses, as it has since 2007, it really becomes difficult to see any benefit from trade. And therefore, I would say that we're not going to have a serious discussion on international trade in this country until our economic prospects improve somewhat, until people feel better about their own personal situations, until they see more in the way of exports that come from their individual communities. When you see exports that are sent from your own town or your own county or your state, you feel a little differently about trade. So the alfalfa farmers in Utah, I don't think thought much about China. I think they were fearful of China. When that market opened, the alfalfa market, just like when the soybean market opened in China, and Iowa, kind of the farmers of Iowa sort of changed completely, they all of a sudden go from enemy or potential enemy to customer. And trade becomes a currency of peace, which has to be seen and experienced. And right now we just don't have enough people in this country who are seeing the benefits of trade, and therefore it becomes a very, very difficult lift politically.
Thanks very much. The last question is your other area of expertise, which is U.S.-China relations. And you've been inside the machine, as it were, making China policy. This is another area in which the public doesn't fully understand accomplishments that are made, challenges that are faced, and policies that are raised. So I wanted to ask you which aspects of our China policy have been most successful and at least appreciated in the society, and how would you convey that sense to the public? And then what aspects of the policy do you see as most problematic, most in need of attention and improvement, not just in the bilateral relationship, but in what we're doing in Washington to engage the Chinese government and the Chinese people?
This is, you know, I reflect back onto the debate stage where I stood a dozen times during the presidential run. And it was always interesting to note the very short and dismissive conversations we'd have about China. It was always sent away at a soundbite. And I'd stand on there on the end of the stage, and by the time they got to me, Tom, we'd probably declared war on China 3 or 4 times. and the first guy would say, well, I'm going to declare war on China on day 1. And the next guy would stand up and say, I'm going to declare war on China before you declare war on China. and they get around to me and I'd say, well, I manage this relationship out in the field. Let me just tell you what we might want to be thinking about in terms of how we position ourselves and the strategy we might want to consider going forward. I didn't get any applause lines, needless to say. It was, get that Huntsman guy off the stage. We want some red meat. So I found that it's really hard during a time when this nation desperately needs a thoughtful, cogent conversation on the most important relationship of the 21st century. That's what you expect to happen during campaigns, right? And we didn't get it, and we missed a huge opportunity. And because the Republicans didn't force the debate, we never heard anything from President Obama. He didn't have to respond. And so we lost out this country, I think, on a very important moment in time to hear about a strategy for this country going forward in a lot of different ways, but certainly with respect to our most important relationship for your generation, and I have no question about that. And I do believe that the history of the 21st century will largely come down to the rise of China being one of the central issues or the central stories of the century. But the narrative really will be about how the world responded, and particularly how the United States responded to the rise of China. Was it out of fear? And did it result in catastrophe? Or was it based on opportunity and shared interests? We're all going to have our disagreements. That's just a given. But we must recognize that increasingly we have a marriage, and divorce isn't an option. You've got to make it work. And that's a hard thing for the political class to understand. Because when you're out at a town hall meeting, it's so much easier to say what you're going to do to China. That's always an applause line. I can get an applause line everywhere I go. I know exactly what to say. The harder conversation is to say what we're going to do with China. That's the conversation that we're not having. And we're missing kind of a critical moment. And here's why it's important. So we've had, Tom, to answer part of your question, I think the successes have been the fact that in 40-plus years since the Shanghai Communique of February 1972, we've created a relationship that is now $500 billion in trade. China is increasingly our largest export market, exports, and will be more and more as we move into the 21st century as they rebalance toward more of a consumption model. And we have 200,000 students here. And I was at a college a couple of days ago, and a student from Beijing stood up and asked a great sophisticated question in fluent English. And I said, I just want to stop everybody here and note one thing. This student has come all the way from China, learned our language, read the books, assimilated into the classroom, and is carrying on this conversation. And I just want you to know that we have tens of thousands of students, and I'd compliment them every time I saw them in Beijing, who are in China doing the same thing. So how is it that we take 42, 43 years of progress? Drama, to be sure, ups and downs. You know, as Winston Lord used to say, it's a sweet and sour relationship, and it is a sweet and sour relationship. The only way you kind of get it moving toward, I think, a sustainable future, you have to have two things. One, we have to have the human talent to move it forward. And I worry about that a little bit because I remember my first trip to China was with President Reagan on his first trip, which was in the early 80s, and I was just a young advance man. And Mao suits, no English, no degrees on the wall from great university, and no understanding of the United States. The days of the Central Planning Commission. And in my work as the U.S. ambassador in China, a job I loved, you walk into any ministry and you find a level of sophistication, English, a nuanced and deep understanding of America. And I walk out of those meetings and I think, okay, I know what we face at the negotiating table. Now let me find the counterpart on our side. Who in Congress can do that in reverse? Who in our executive branch can do that in reverse? And I say we're slowly being diminished in terms of human capacity because it doesn't pay politically to do China. It pays to do other things where there are more immediate dividends. Now that's okay now, but we'll reach a point in time where we're outdone at the negotiating table. And we don't have the human capacity in terms of language, politics, economics, culture, to be able to drive the relationship in ways that would suggest the ping ping hung hung the jiga lai wang, you know, the harmonious relationship going forward. So you have to have the human capacity, number one. Number two, I've always believed, Tom, that the relationship works better when we have something to do. And today we don't have a big thing to do. And by that I go back to the 70s and 80s where we were brought together on a real balance of power basis because of the Soviet Union. That's why Kissinger did what he did. It's why Nixon did what he did. It's kind of how we developed some collaborative partnerships that this country might not hear about for another couple of decades that were pretty sophisticated and deep between the U.S. and China that have continued on. It was the Soviet Union and the threat of the Soviet Union that brought us together. We had something to do. And then there was WTO accession during the 90s under Zhu Rongji, who really orchestrated it as the premier from the Chinese side. And we were negotiating round after round. China was giving on market access, dropping tariff and non-tariff barriers, opening things like insurance and financial services markets. And we were moving the dialogue. And then China got into the WTO November of 2001. I was there as trade ambassador. And it was a pretty important moment. And then kind of since then, we have not had a big thing to do together. And I used to have this conversation with Richard Holbrooke, somebody I miss a lot. I miss our conversations because we used to talk a bit about a new communique between the United States and China. So we have 3 communiques that drive the relationship. Tom knows them all by heart, I'm sure. You know, we had 72, and then we ended with the Taiwan Relations Act, I think, of 82. And a lot has happened since 82, needless to say. And we need something that brings us together around a big goal, defining our place in the world, defining our shared interests along with areas where we diverge, because there are plenty of those as well, and something that really begins to define and articulate what a global relationship means, because we've never had a global relationship like this, and neither has China. And being able to work together toward further sort of enshrining this relationship, I think, would be a very difficult, but I think a worthwhile undertaking.
Thanks very much. I want to open it up to questions, but I want to make 2 requests. One is I would like the students to ask the questions first to get priority over the faculty and other older people in the audience, for lack of a better word. And I also would ask you strongly to phrase your question in the form of a question. Please don't make a speech because you're using up other people's time and we want to hear what the ambassador has to say. So please ask your questions, please line up at the mics, and please, students first.
If I can't answer it, Gracie will.
Please, why don't we start on the right? We'll go back and forth, okay? We'll start on the right.
First, Governor, I'd like to say thank you for coming today. It's a real pleasure to get to talk to somebody of your stature in the educational realm. As somebody who studies national security but has maybe studied areas that don't have the long-term dividends that you talked about from studying China, from someone who's coming from a more general security perspective, what do you think the most important fact to give someone in maybe my position about to begin graduate school would say to know about China?
About what? One more time about what?
About China, generally as a security issue.
I think it's important to dig deep in China's history about what motivates and drives her worldview. So as not to confuse a popular narrative about China wanting to take over the world or providing this risk or that, I think we have to look at their history, their culture, their influences, and say, what is it that they want? What drives them? What are their interests? What is driving their own national security and their defense buildup, which is quite remarkable, and as it relates to our 7th Fleet, quite dangerous going forward. And I would say that that is as much an exercise in the social sciences, if I could put it that way. I don't think we have enough people in the United States who really have gone back to those touchstones in China's history that are still running as a current through the thinking of the modern day leadership about security, about sovereignty, about recent history vis-a-vis Japan and Southeast Asia, Vietnam specifically. And here we have China putting up a tent or a garrison in the disputed land with India. So the part about sovereignty, why they feel the way they do about it, and their traditional aspects of Chinese culture that play into their view of the world, I think is terribly important to understand for policymakers. We must be informed when we develop our own responses.
Please say your name and where you're from, because I want to make that the norm for the rest of the questions.
My name's Alex Orleans. I'll admit I'm not a Princeton student. I'm a Georgetown graduate student who came up to see you.
Great to see you. And you got to tell me before you sit down, What do you, in fact, the anecdote I just shared was at Georgetown from the other night from the Chinese student. So what are you going to do to change the world?
I hope to help our intelligence community get back to focusing on actual intelligence rather than simply manhunting.
Good. Thank you. Go for it.
Thank you.
Sir?
Hi, my name is Taman Narayan. I'm a senior economics major here, and I'm from San Jose, California. And I wanted to say I really appreciated all your discussion about trying to erode the sort of extreme partisanship that has sort of paralyzed any hope of economic policy. But I wanted to know your answer to the question is whether you stand by your comments that you would reject a budget deal with $10 in spending cuts for every $1 in tax revenue.
We all make mistakes. May I put that in perspective for just a moment?
Please.
Because I've reflected on that a lot. So here's the reality. You know, first of all, for those of you who haven't run for president before, it's important to imagine what it's like on the stage, right? So this was my first presidential debate. I'd run for governor twice and really enjoyed it and had some good opponents who I ran against. This was my first presidential debate. It was in Iowa. Now, I had already fallen out of favor pretty quickly with many in Iowa because I wasn't much into soybean subsidies. And if you want to incur the wrath of some farmers, that should be your position. And they'd asked me already in the debate about civil unions. And I said, yes, in fact, as governor of Utah, I did support that, as I do support now marriage equality. And it was, you could hear 4 people in the back row who did this in an auditorium of 4,000 people. And that question came up, and it was one of these surreal moments because this is an important conversation about spending, about debt, about tax policy. And it's like, we're going to ask you a 10-to-1 question, and then you have 3 seconds to answer. It's like, okay, do I want to, as governor, I'd never raised taxes. We got the economy moving. We delivered a flat tax. I took the sales tax off food. I mean, a lot of fun and interesting things. And I thought, do I want to throw away my tax credentials in a 3-second answer and have to explain for the next few months why I did that? Or do I just give an answer and be able to walk away, you know, without the level of injury? And I look back and I say, it deserved fuller discussion because it's such an important question. And my answer should have been, the American people deserve more than a raising of hands on an issue this important. And of course, I don't care whether you're in business or academia or politics, if you get a 10-to-1 deal on the table, my initial response was, well, that is never going to happen. I mean, that's not the real world, so why even give a response to that? But there you are. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm John Ma. I'm a sophomore economics major from Arcadia, California. Beautiful place in California.
I'm a Californian originally.
My question is, recently in the news there's been a lot of talk about North Korea and nuclear threat, but I was wondering, what about the problem with Taiwan and China? Is that still an existing issue, and is that going to be a problem spot in the future? And what role will the U.S. play in that regard?
That's a great question. Now, let me just answer it this way, because I've lived in Taiwan twice. Once in the late 70s and early 80s when Taiwan was under martial law, and Chiang Ching-kuo was in charge, and no opposition parties, no freedom of the press. You know, they could round you up on the street corner on charges of sedition and send you away. And then I lived a second time in the 80s. Actually, at the time, Tom, when Chiang Ching-kuo passed away and Lee Teng-hui rose, and the opposition parties became legal, and Xu Xinliang arrived at CCK Airport to 10,000 greeters. I mean, it was, for me, being there during that time was very interesting. If you had told me then that I would live long enough to see 300-plus direct flights between China and Taiwan a week, I would have called you insane. And if you said, yeah, and you're also going to live long enough to see a free trade agreement between China and Taiwan called ECFA, and I met both with Ma Ying-jeou, the president of Taiwan, this last summer, as I have Wang Yi, who was the manager of the Taiwan relationship on the Beijing side. Both very competent people. And the sense of steadiness that exists about the points of connection, taking ECFA, while it's not been implemented, there's a lot of work to do going forward, but it keeps people occupied. And what it has created is a zone of prosperity and predictability in an area that was the ultimate flashpoint in this world. I mean, you had Kashmir, you may have had the Korean Peninsula, you had the Taiwan Strait. That was it. Today, it's no longer the case. You have to be vigilant, and we still have an important security relationship with Taiwan. But as Lee Kuan Yew used to tell me in Singapore, he said, let Taiwan and China work this one out. You can be a backstop, but don't screw it up. And that was probably 20 plus years ago. And he predicted exactly what would play out. He said they'll come together economically, and he said, and then they'll begin talking probably about security and, you know, military-to-military cooperation, maybe search and rescue things at sea, and then they'll start talking about more of the sovereignty issues and, you know, and go from there. Who knows what the outcome will be, but that conversation will continue. And I watch in complete amazement. Complete amazement because I've lived long enough to see that, and I've lived long enough to be able to sit in the foreign ministry in Beijing, where the first 30 minutes isn't a harangue about Taiwan. It doesn't even come up. And I walk out of those meetings thinking, could this be real? We talked about 10 things and Taiwan didn't even come up. So here you are. Steadiness will matter going forward.
Thank you.
Hi, Ambassador. My name is Seiron Fu, and I'm a first-year master's student here at the Woodrow Wilson School.
Thank you.
And I was a state staffer in a state house that had term limits in California. And so part of the criticism there was that legislators lacked relationships and the time to craft compromise. So how many terms would be appropriate for Congress in terms of allowing those relationships to develop in terms of crafting policy and compromise?
Well, let me just say, as a governor, governors don't serve very long. You know, they might serve a term or two, and you become very close. So when I chaired the Western Governors Association, we actually wrote, you can go look it up, I wrote it with Janet Napolitano, who's now the Secretary of Homeland Security. She was then governor of Arizona. We actually got together, Republican, and wrote an immigration reform proposal for the federal government, because we are so sick and tired of the federal government doing nothing. Pull that out sometime and see if it probably is right about where we're going to land after years and years of rancorous debate. And we had every single Republican and Democrat signed on to that. In the Western U.S., that's 20 states, California to Texas, which my friend Rick Perry likes to remind us is sometimes a foreign country. And up to, and Rick is a great friend. I don't mean that disparagingly. He just likes to poke fun at himself sometimes. Up to North Dakota and right to Alaska. A big chunk of land, and every Republican and Democrat signed on to that document. That, you know, we were friendly, we were collaborative, we were thinking about the best interests of the people we represented. Some had been in for 2 years. Some of us had known each other for 6 months. So I would say, let Congress figure out what a standard should be for service. But people ought to get in, and I think our founding documents and Federalist Papers and such would suggest that we get in, make a measure of our best contribution as professionals, and move on. Whether that's 10 to 12 years in Congress, a couple of terms in the Senate, I think it'd be a good thing. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Eddie. I'm a junior in the Near Eastern Studies Department. And my question is, I remember a quote from the presidential campaign from around maybe August, where Timothy Geithner said of Paul Ryan something to the effect of, "We don't really have a concrete plan for the economy, we just know we don't like yours." And my question for you with regards to that is, do you think the Obama administration really has a concrete plan for the economy? And more specifically, do you think the Obama administration is really committed to reducing the deficit, or is he just trying to muddle through politically as best he can?
Well, that's a loaded question.
Sorry, and I know it's a loaded question. I'm sorry about that.
And I like it, I must say. I like it. You know, I don't think you can have a complete economic policy without serious tax reform. I thought what Simpson-Bowles brought about was a revelation. I thought it did on spending and on tax reform, and although they left a lot on the entitlement side to the imagination, you have to do something on Medicare. Let's just face the facts. With the double-digit growth on the Medicare side, you have to corral spending somehow. So what's the biggest driver of costs of the Pentagon right now? Healthcare. You've got to do something about the costs. So I think the administration missed a huge opportunity by not taking Simpson Bowles and saying this is our economic policy and running forward. I think they would have owned the real estate, and I think Congress ultimately would have come around and seen enough to like about it to begin to really get us talking about some economic fundamentals. One of my big gripes is that the country wants to grow. We want to get moving. And it's almost as if the private marketplace has dug a ditch right around Washington, made it totally irrelevant. You wait and wait and wait. You need guidance on taxes, you need guidance on the regulatory environment, and there isn't enough there in terms of predictability. So it moves on. And we might even see a 3 in front of our GDP growth next year. Who knows? But what would it be if we had an economic plan that really spoke to firing the engines of growth? To my mind, that is immigration, that is tax reform, and that is energy policy as well. And in all 3 of those areas, we seem to be spending a bit.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Ambassador Huntsman. My name is Gina Triolo. I'm a junior in the computer science department, and I'm from Bluebell, Pennsylvania. My question for you is, you mentioned how during your campaign, as soon as you began to get some support from some prominent Democrats, your polling numbers began to go down. So my question is, do you think there will ever be a time where having bipartisan support during the primaries would be helpful under our current system, or is that always going to be a negative thing?
I say that a bit tongue in cheek, but they did come out, and as did President Carter. And I was happy with all of the endorsements. They were just ill-timed, and pretty much the wrong side of the aisle. I don't know what the future is going to bring, but here's what my gut tells me. And it's why the work we're doing with No Labels, I think, is really important. So what are we doing with No Labels? We're building a problem solvers caucus on Capitol Hill. We have 60, and we're shooting for 100 by the end of the year. And I think we'll have it, because I had no clue that we would have 60 at this point, and here we are. Equal numbers, Republicans and Democrats. They run the gamut from Dean Heller, Tea Party guy from Nevada, to Angus King, independent from Maine. And I chaired the group just 2 days ago on Capitol Hill, and we packed into this room. And more people are signing up, cross aisles. It's just an amazing thing. And I think the marketplace is doing this. And I'll have to come back and correct myself if it doesn't. But I think for the last few years, we've sent people back to Congress with the instruction to just blow the place up. Stymie, obfuscate, make sure no work gets done. And we've been pretty successful at that. And to the point where we don't even have a budget after 3 or 4 years. Say nothing of a balanced budget. I had to work with a balanced budget when I was governor. I'm just talking about a budget. And I think the people in this country are going to be so incensed that we have gone nowhere on the fundamentals that they will start demanding at town hall meetings and in interaction with candidates, what are you going to do to get the work of the people done? What are you going to do to reach across the aisle to achieve just the fundamentals? I think that clarion call by the people has to be present, as it was in just the reverse form when the bottom fell out of the economy, and then it was debt that really drove a lot of concern, and they sent people back to Washington with pretty strict orders to do nothing. No spending, no nothing until we get our budget in line. So we'll see what lies around the bend, but the American people will have to drive it.
All right, thank
Thank you. What are you going to do to change the world?
So I'm hopefully going into the software industry, and I would really like to work in computer security, making things safer online, preventing against hackers and other dangers on the
Good
internet.
work. Go for it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One of mine.
Thank you, Ambassador Huntsman, for your comments. I'm George Maliha, a senior in the molecular biology department. And I'm curious about how China's leadership views the United States. What do they want us to do? How do they view the fight? And what do they want to do with us going forward? You talk about this relationship being a marriage. What's their view of it?
This might sound a little strange, but I think there's actually a reservoir of some goodwill when you have somebody like Xi Jinping with a daughter studying right here in the United States. You can't have a child studying here in this country without feeling some sense of respect for our traditions and our culture and our institutions of higher learning, which I think are respected widely by people, by the leadership in China as being the very best in the world. Is there some ambivalence about where the relationship goes? Is there some sense of disconnect on in terms of where our economy is going? So they're much less apt to want to hear out our admonition on free markets and on trade liberalization when our economy has gone where it has. We have to practice it at home in order to have our words resonate. We can't stand on a soapbox, given our nation's condition, and expect to move the world. People were listening a few short years ago, and a lot of things out there kind of changed that dynamic, and we have to win it back, because I'm also convinced that that voice in the international community is indispensable from the United States. So there's a reservoir of goodwill. I think there's a sense that we've lost a bit of our leadership and a bit of our high ground on many of the issues we care about because of the last few years. What they would like, I believe, is a long-term strategic dialogue with the United States that gave them a sense of our long-term priorities, which we find almost impossible to do. So when you sit down with your Chinese counterpart, on the Chinese side of the table, you find probably some of the best long-term strategic thinkers in the world. And on the American side, some of the best short-term tactical thinkers in the world. And there's a divide. It's bridging that gap that really is the challenge. And I think that's what China would like to do. They'd like to figure out how to get us together in a dialogue that allows us to begin to bridge that gap, where we're going economically longer term, what our deployment patterns are going to be in 20 years, so on and so forth. And they're confused a little bit by our never-ending transitions and changes in executive branch positions. And I think that's used against us, too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi there, Ambassador Huntsman. My name is Matt Saunders. I'm a sophomore in the politics department. I think one of the reasons that we all admire you is because in your career, with the opportunity to make so many decisions and take so many stances, you've often taken the right one or the more moderate one that might not necessarily help you in the next election.
We see where that's got me.
So, my question to you is, knowing that you intended to run for president, you had all of these decisions like being able to serve your country, but under the Obama administration. How do you rationalize the political costs of these decisions in a world where you really need to win to govern?
I appreciate those comments, and I hardly live up to what you described. But I've always felt that if you do the right things for the right reasons, ultimately you'll come out okay. And if you lose the election, you can live with yourself. And that's what's important to me. And I hope it's important to the next generation, because the American people demand a little courage, number one, and I think they demand a little authenticity. And in today's political marketplace, which are largely driven by consultants and advisors who package you up, I mean, I can't stand this kind of thing. And, many are forced into a box, and you lose any sense of authenticity, who you are. And sometimes you end up taking three sides of every issue. And we wonder why the believability factor in politics has completely tanked. We wonder why Congress is trading at a 12% approval rate. Give me a break. The representative body of the greatest democracy on earth, 12%. I think there's a lot to it. So make the right decisions that are guided by your instincts, and you don't look back. And do you pay a political price for that? Of course. But then you're heartened a little bit when, after the election plays out, you have some people who maybe a little sheepishly come up and say, well, you're actually on the right side of a few of those issues. We might want to come around on them. But you all in your own public service careers, and I hope you choose to do that. And let me just say this: you're the best and the brightest of your generation. You'll be lured by consulting and Wall Street and hedge funds all that. All I would say is forget about it. Forget about that. Go. I didn't mean for that to be an applause
Need
line.
some of them to do it to get the alumni money.
That's good point, Tom. I'm not going to say that's the easy way out, but I'm saying people like you with the best training in the world and access to the best information and mentors, which is a critical part of your education, you need to fix the system. This isn't, the 1950s where we're just cruising along and all is well. We have some issues. We have some structural problems. We can rehabilitate ourselves, I have no doubt, but it's going to take people who have the best brains, energy, and drive and solutions to get in, open up the hood of the car, and fix it, driven by your gut instincts. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Tejas. I also study molecular biology, and I want to thank you very much for your strong support of science, both in the campaign and now you talked about the genomics that you're working on. And I'm wondering, how can we permeate science both in our culture and our politics better?
I think basic research is fundamentally one of the most important engines of growth we have in this country. We have led the world, and it breaks my heart to see us begin to slip, because with that basic research and that creating new stuff, intellectual property, new breakthroughs, we lose our standing in the world. And that, I think, has been a critical part of our success going forward. We have to prove the point that our basic research yields something, and we have to make the case better than we are today. And we have to get back to good science informing our public policy. Now, imagine my surprise, when I had to stand on the debate stage of the Ronald Reagan Library, where I gave a speech a couple of weeks ago, and say, you can't be against science and win elections. You have to be the science. You have to be the party of science. That's ultimately going to drive our destiny. It can't be any other way. And I do believe that to be the case. And I always tried as governor to bring in the best, most informed scientific folks, whether it was on the environment, climate, public-private collaborative relationships on higher ed campuses. Give me the facts and let us build public policy around that. So I don't know a whole lot of physicists or climatologists in Congress, but everybody seems to have an opinion, you know what I mean? We just need to kind of quiet down and bring in the experts and say, tell us what's going on. Let us shape policies around quantifiable realities out there, that which is empirical, and that will serve the American people. So I think we'll get back to that model. I think it's the only one that serves this country. And I also want to see this nation do well economically, because we need to support the National Institutes of Health. We need to support the National Cancer Institute. We need to support EDARPA at the Energy Department. A lot of stuff is just beyond the reach of the private sector. I'm sorry. I come from the private sector. And it's beyond the reach of the private sector, and it's stuff that only the government can do. And we've let out there, and I don't want to see us lose that edge.
Thank you very much.
Ambassador, thank you so much for speaking with us here today. My name is Hannah Sheets-Freimiller, and I'm a first-year master's student at the Woodrow Wilson School from Anchorage, Alaska. I really appreciated your comments on the structural problems we have in our political system and how that partisan discord is preventing us to finding solutions that are crucial to the future of my generation. On that topic, I have two questions for you. The first is, what do you think the Republican Party looks like in 2025? Who are its stakeholders, and what are its bedrock principles? And the second, you talked about independent redistricting as being some of the root of our partisan problem. So I'm curious on what states you think have the most promise for that type of reform.
On the Republican Party going forward, this is why I think 2016 is a very important year. Because if the Republican, I don't care where you all come down politically, Republican or Democrat, a two-party system is good for this country. It ensures robust debate, and it keeps people honest, and it's a good thing overall. I don't think you're ever better served by a dominant one party and a weakened second party. So let's just start with that premise. In order for that to be the case, I think the Republicans have to do well in 2016. If they lose, here's what I think happens. you're out until 2024. You talk about 2025. You know, you're out until 2024. How in today's ever-changing, rapidly advancing world can an alternative governing party, as the American people see it, stay relevant when the lights have been out for that long? And when the last time you governed, the world looked like this and the economy looked like that. You've got to govern to prove the point that you have what it takes to move the American people. And that's why I think 2016 is critical in terms of timing. I don't think it can wait until 2024. I think there are two fundamentally disruptive features that will play out whether we realize and appreciate it or not. You, the millennials, are largely unaffiliated, if you know what I mean. The fastest growing party in America, even in Utah, is the unaffiliated party. It isn't the young Republicans, young Democrats, you know, young libertarian, young vegetarians. It's the unaffiliated party. So that's a demographic that's moving along out there. At the same time, you've got this disruptive technology called the internet. And while it hasn't transformed politics like it has practically every other industry in the world, it will at some point. People will figure out how to harness its energy more and more for fundraising purposes, for organizing, for disseminating information. So you've got those two phenomena running in common. And I think they disrupt the marketplace at some point. If you don't have a strong two-party system, you'll have one that is sort of diminished and something else put in it. I don't know about a third party. You can talk about a third party, but I think our system is generally built for two-party interaction. It's what that Republican Party looks like or what stands in its place if it cannot deliver for the American people, and I think the clock is running. The second question, I'm sorry.
So you talked about independent redistricting, and I'm curious what states you think have the most promise for that type of reform?
What states you say?
Yeah, what states? New Hampshire, California?
About what kind of reform?
Independent redistricting?
Independent redistricting. Well, I would take you to a conversation that I had with a former senator from the state of Washington. Slade Gordon is his name. We served together on a cybersecurity commission. And he's a wise man. And he sits on their independent redistricting commission. And it's pretty new, from what I understand. And they have you know, half dozen Republicans, half dozen Democrats, or whatever represents the political makeup of the state, and they try to carve out districts that are as close to 50-50 as they can find. And if you want a more recent example, go to what Idaho is doing and take a look at their most recent attempt at, it's happening, and I think people are recognizing the need to do something about it, and I think that's a powerful, powerful message out there. It's going to have to be picked up on and moved double time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here today, Ambassador Huntsman. I'm Rana Ibrahim. I'm a sophomore in the Woodrow Wilson School from Long Island, New York. My question is, considering your comments today regarding the effects of super PACs influencing political pressure, how would you respond to President Obama's comments on Wednesday regarding the NRA's role in placing political pressure on a vote against gun control regulation that would extend background checks on online and gun show sales?
Well, you have to say, what would the outcome have been if you take the money and if you take the special interest out of the equation? I think we would have had a different outcome. People have a right to lobby, there's no question about that. But the money that filters in and the challenges that people perceive in their primary battles, funded by a lot of out-of-state sources. So what if we were just to do this on campaign finance reform? What if we were just to say, unless you can vote for somebody, you can't give money? If you can vote for somebody, you can give them money. And if somebody from the outside wants to provide money, it has to come in through somebody who actually votes for them in the state. There are ways to, I think, approach the money in politics and the way that it results in public policy choices, and I think the last couple of days is an example of that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I've been told that we can only ask one more question, but I hate to leave the last person on either line, so I'm going to strain my relationship with my dean and say we'll take two questions at once, one from the first person on each line. And I apologize to the others. Time is limited, and your interest is very much appreciated.
Hi, I'm Gavin. I'm a senior in the molecular biology department, and my question is rooted in two observations. One, that politicians tend to like to throw around academic studies as evidence for their particular viewpoints, and the second, which has been shown pretty robustly this past week by this recent debt to GDP study that was largely discredited, is that a lot of those studies are actually bogus. So my question for you is, what do you think the role of academia is in government, and how can we be leveraging what academia has to offer to better govern a country?
Okay, that's part A. Here's part B.
Thanks, Gavin. That's a good question.
And my name's Luigi Magwa. I'm a junior at the Woodrow Wilson School. I'm originally from Lagos, Nigeria. And you mentioned President Kennedy's speech at American University and how he outlined America's plan for engaging with the world. And just in reference to another thing you said, he talked about how America is seeing what they can do to countries. So looking at Africa, a lot of our relationship with America, Africans, has been on what America is going to do to us. What do you think America should really be talking about in terms of engaging the developing world with what they can do together? And how do you think that relationship is going to evolve?
First of all, on information and data, it's a surreal experience when you're a candidate and you do town hall meeting after town hall meeting, and you realize that everybody gets their sources of information from some different outlet, and they're absolutely convinced that what they're saying is the truth. And how you get around to reliable data that is trustworthy, that is reliable, that can drive policy discussions, I don't know how we get there, but all I can tell you is there is a need in the marketplace for, I think the role of universities are critically important in this particular regard. How do you benchmark and come up with reliable, quantifiable data that will drive healthcare discussions, that will drive our tax reform discussions? You have to do it. You know, when I did tax reform in my state, I brought in the university experts, and I had them all sit in a room and kind of come up with common benchmarking so that we could at least present something to the people of my state that was reliable. But when you have, a lot of folks in this country who have sources of data that they passionately rely upon that sometimes, may not be from reliable sources, and it's infused into the debate, even down to the well of Congress, I don't know what you do about that, because unless you have reliable information, it becomes almost impossible to make good policy going forward. Universities will have to play a role, and that will be something that you all need to think about going forward. This how we arrive at good, respected, reliable information. No longer do we have Walter Cronkite saying, "Good night, everybody. Here was the war in Vietnam. Here's Watergate. Here's what you all need to think as you go to bed." You wake up in the LA Times, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune. They were sources of information. It was pretty simple. Today it's a much different dynamic, and it's having an impact on our policy making, I'm convinced. In terms of America's involvement around the world, let our light shine. You know what I mean? We've made some mistakes in recent years, and we're paying a price. And sometimes we don't rely on that data to drive decisions. But America is recognized for its name brand, whether we like it or not, overseas. And I can't help but see this whenever I'm overseas and live overseas. We're recognized for a country dedicated to liberty and democracy and human rights and free markets. And when we speak up in reliable, helpful ways, not in condescending or threatening ways, we can move history. And we have people who listen and say, I want to hear more. I want our people emancipated. I want more freedom. We want good, clean, transparent government. We want to engage with the world. And America can play a role in the transformation of regions and countries of the world. But A, we have to live it at home and be respected as a practitioner who is doing it well enough to be seen and respected abroad. And two, I think we have to develop a network of relationships around the world that really do allow them to see the real values that are inherent in the American system, as opposed to threatening aspects, as opposed to intervention that have, I think, had in some measures a devastating impact on real American values being shined overseas. Thank you very much.
Thank you.